We talked a little bit about interest rates and Social Security, Medicare, and the intergenerational wealth transfer. So let me see if I can put all that together. So, we typically think about Social Security. We tax, or Social Security and Medicare, we tax younger workers, the payroll tax, and we pay benefits, Social Security, monthly cash benefits and health insurance benefits under Medicare. So there's an intergenerational wealth transfer of taxing workers and transferring it to retirees and seniors and disabled. And then we also talked about interest rates and how low interest rates have allowed older generations to buy into the stock market through their retirement plans and to buy into housing. We've seen a huge increase in the cost of housing. And so I guess from your perspective, Gene, how much has younger generations, in a sense, they're the recipients or I should say the recipients, they're perhaps suffering from both of these effects because, they're bearing the tax burden of the transfer payment programs like Social Security, Medicare, but they're also bearing the burden of low interest rates because what's happened that their parents and grandparents have bought into housing, they bought into stock market, and we've seen the value of stocks and the value of housing go up so that now younger workers are facing the prospects of being unable to buy a house. They're facing the prospect with markets still at relatively all-time highs. They're unlikely to see the same high rates of return going forward, certainly in the near term. So, are younger generations doubly burdened by both the low interest rate policy and the entitlement policy?
I think you actually stated it correctly, Steve. I'm not sure I need to elaborate on it. They clearly are. The question has always been that if the younger generations are a lot richer than the older generations, then there's an argument that maybe it's not so bad if older generations pass on additional debt to them. I don't necessarily buy into that argument. It seems to be the long history of humankind is that each generation tries to make things better for the next generation. And in some sense, in a social sense, we've done something very, very unique in modern times. We've no longer necessarily have older generations making those types of transfers to younger generations, but coming to expect, indirectly often, maybe not directly, coming to expect that the younger generations are going to be the ones that they rely upon, at least to a much greater extent than in the past. The history, and you know it better than almost anyone, Steve, but the history of Social Security and Medicare and healthcare in general has been one where a lot was promised to early generations, which they didn't have to save for. And that was a good idea because the elderly particularly, but also the disabled and some other groups we protected them, were poorer than everyone else. That's still no longer necessarily true. In fact, some latest CBO numbers say that the elderly are now richer, if you count at least the value of their health care, and we could debate whether that should be counted or not, are richer than the younger generation. So how much more should we increasingly make transfers from the young to the old? And actually, there's a great confirmation of your thesis, which shows up in the data. You don't have to believe me because you think maybe I'm speaking politically or have some biased view. If you look at what's happened to the wealth distribution in the economy, it's not just the young. You compare something over the last 30 or 40 years, and I may have these statistics inexact. I could give them to you on the side. But the oldest generation, the people who are now retired, their wealth relative to 30 or 40 years ago has essentially doubled. And the wealth of the economy is more than doubled. So that makes sense. You go down to the groups that are like 40 to 50, and their growth rate is whatever, 50, 60, 70%. You go down to the young, and it's often negative. Whereas, the notion that rising tide will raise all boats, it hasn't done that. It's raised this boat and lowered some of the other boats over time. And that's just in the data on what's happening to the young versus the old. And so I don't keep talking too much. We could add student debt to this problem.